It was a morning like any other in the town of Flaxborough. The sun hung high in the sky, dappling the cobbled streets with patches of light and shadow as the town square buzzed with its usual mix of local chatter. The air smelled faintly of bread and cut grass, and the general hum of a market town waking from its slumber filled the streets. But amidst the ordinary, something was afoot, as always, when Inspector Purbright was called into action. It all began, as so many things do in Flaxborough, at the flower show. The local garden club had its annual display, and the flowers were in full bloom: dahlias, roses, and chrysanthemums in riotous hues, arranged in elaborate vases and polished pots. The attendees were, as usual, a select group of the town's elderly ladies, each of whom had entered with the stiff competition in mind, though their main interest seemed more rooted in socializing than the actual judging. Among the regulars was Mrs. Mildred Ackers, a quiet widow who lived at number 17, Blackfriars Lane, a modest street tucked behind the post office. Mildred was a woman of unassuming presence, with the sort of charm that required careful attention to uncover. She had been a widow for 5 years, ever since her late husband, the somewhat distant and perpetually unwell Bernard Ackers, had passed away under curious circumstances. It was never an issue, however, as no one in town thought much of the death beyond the customary remarks on how sad it was. Bernard had, after all, never been a figure of great interest. At the flower show, Mildred spent most of her time talking with Mrs. Olivia Turner, a widow of much more dramatic flair, known for her sharp tongue and her extravagant hats. The two of them often sat together in the corner, exchanging pleasantries, and when Mildred whispered a comment about the rose arrangements being a touch too lavish for her taste, Olivia laughed, a sound that was too bright, too hollow, to be genuine. As they spoke, they exchanged polite remarks about the various arrangements, but there was something in Olivia's posture that suggested she might be less interested in the roses and more in the man standing at the back of the hall, Mr. Armitage, the local solicitor. He was a man of mid-height, with greying hair and a faintly disapproving expression. His eyes had a tendency to linger too long on some of the younger women at these events, and his manner, while polite, was the kind that suggested he always knew something that others didn't. This caused many of the townsfolk to feel rather uneasy around him. It was a slight and unremarkable moment in an unremarkable morning, but as the ladies were about to move toward the refreshment table, the situation took a turn. Mildred's purse, a worn leather item that had seen better days, slipped from her lap and landed with an odd thud, drawing the attention of several nearby guests. When she reached down to retrieve it, something caught her eye, a small scrap of paper tucked into the folds of the purse. No one had noticed it before, and certainly no one had seen Mildred put it there. Curious, Mildred unfolded the paper. A single line was written on it. "You should have left well enough alone, Mrs. Ackers." The words were unsettling enough, though there was nothing in the tone that suggested immediate danger. Mildred's hands trembled for a moment before she hid the paper from view, her face flushing a shade darker. She quietly crumpled the note in her palm and slipped it back into her purse before anyone could ask what she had found. But it was clear to Olivia that something had happened, and she gave Mildred a curious, almost knowing glance before returning her attention to the solicitor. It wasn't long before Mildred made her way home. She moved quickly down Blackfriars Lane, a little faster than usual, as if the afternoon sun had grown too hot, or perhaps the secret in her purse was now too heavy for her. She didn't notice the shadow that followed her, an all too familiar shadow to the residents of Flaxborough. Inspector Purbright, who had been sitting in the cafe just opposite the flower show, sipping his usual cup of tea and reading the morning papers, had seen the exchange. He was not one to rush into things, and so he made no immediate move. He simply observed, as he often did, with the quiet patience of a man who knew that people rarely revealed the truth in one bold gesture. It was always the little things that gave it away. The next morning, Purbright received a call. It was Mrs. Turner who had found him. The widow had reported a strange incident. Mrs. Ackers was missing. She had not appeared at her usual spot in the market, nor had she shown up to tend to her garden. A quiet, respectable woman like Mildred, never one for extravagant disappearances, was nowhere to be found. Purbright's instincts kicked in. This was not an ordinary case. There was more to this than the simple disappearance of a widow. He packed his coat, grabbed his notebook, and made his way to Blackfriars Lane. His mind was already piecing together the small details, the strange note, the hurried steps, and the way Olivia Turner had looked at Mildred before she disappeared. He made no assumptions just yet, but he would be asking questions, polite questions, of course, but questions nonetheless. And as always, when Purbright was involved, nothing would remain quiet for long. Inspector Purbright arrived at Blackfriars Lane just as the afternoon sun began to soften its intensity, casting long, slanted shadows over the rows of modest homes. The street was quiet, as it always was, the sort of silence that suggested not peace, but a lack of things to say. The occasional creak of a garden gate, the rustle of leaves in a neglected hedge, and the soft murmur of a dog somewhere behind a fence were the only sounds to break the stillness. As he approached Mrs. Ackers's house, number 17, Purbright observed that the curtains were drawn. Odd for a house that normally embraced the daylight, and especially peculiar for one that had been the site of many a small social gathering during the more vibrant years of its occupant's marriage. The inspector stopped at the gate, adjusting the collar of his coat as he gazed up at the small house. Nothing about the exterior suggested a mystery. The flower boxes were well kept. A few pots stood in orderly rows, their colourful contents vying for attention. Yet there was an unsettling quietness about it all. As he stepped up to the door, Purbright noticed the slight scuff marks on the porch, evidence of hurried movements, perhaps only a day or two old. He rang the bell, but there was no answer. This was not unusual for a widow, but the lack of a response set the stage for what was to come. Mildred Ackers had been a creature of routine, and any disruption in that routine was bound to be noticed. He turned the handle gently, finding the door unlocked. Mildred was, after all, a woman of habit, and her home was her sanctuary. The inside of the house was just as Purbright remembered it from his previous visits, tidy, well-organized and carefully arranged to give the impression of orderliness without any hint of extravagance. The faint smell of lavender lingered in the air, mingling with the faint trace of dust that had begun to settle over the furniture. The hallway was narrow, its walls adorned with faded photographs of a life that seemed to have been lived in the shadows of others. It was the sort of house one might expect to find a widow in, where time seemed to stretch and bend around the walls, clinging to the memories of a bygone era. Purbright made his way to the sitting room. He could hear the faint ticking of the clock on the mantelpiece, a constant reminder that time never paused, even when lives did. The room, however, was empty. A chair by the window sat undisturbed, a small tea tray with its single cup still perched on the edge of the table. Mildred's belongings were as orderly as always, but it was what was missing that struck Purbright most. A letter opener, a silver piece that had always been present on the mantel, was now gone. His eyes narrowed as he began to piece together the morning's events. Mrs. Ackers had been here, no doubt, but something had caused her to leave, or perhaps someone had caused her to leave. He turned his attention to the other room at the back of the house, Mildred's bedroom, where the bed had been made, but the bedside table was ajar. The drawers were slightly open, as though someone had been searching through them, hastily and without care. Mildred, Purbright mused, had always been neat to the point of obsession, and such disorder could not have been accidental. He took a step back, allowing the silence to settle over him. The house held no more answers, only more questions. He needed to speak to the neighbours, and there was one person in particular who he was certain had seen something, Olivia Turner, who had been seen with Mrs. Ackers the day before at the flower show. Purbright knew better than to trust appearances, and Olivia's behaviour had been, well, too perfect in its predictability. Before leaving, he took a final glance at the mantelpiece. A small decorative trinket, a porcelain cat, positioned just above the fireplace, caught his eye. It was an odd little thing, always there, a constant fixture in Mildred's living room. Yet it looked slightly out of place now, its angle shifted ever so slightly. Almost imperceptibly, but noticeable enough for someone paying attention. Purbright reached out and gently nudged the cat back into its usual position. Beneath it, there was a scrap of paper, wedged just out of sight. With a gloved hand, Purbright retrieved it, unfolding it carefully. The paper was old, and the ink on it was smudged, but the words were unmistakable. "She knows too much. Must stop her." The words sent a chill through him. Mildred had been involved in something she perhaps hadn't shared with anyone, and whatever it was, someone had felt the need to silence her. The inspector folded the paper and slipped it into his coat pocket. He had learned enough for now. Turning on his heel, Purbright left the house, his mind already working through the puzzle. He needed to visit Olivia Turner. But there was something else that nagged at him. Something about the way Mrs. Turner had been looking at Mildred the day before. There had been a quiet intensity in her gaze, as though she knew something she shouldn't. Perhaps Mildred hadn't been the only one with secrets. As he walked down Blackfriars Lane, Purbright felt a certain weight settling on his shoulders. This was not an ordinary disappearance. There were too many unanswered questions, too many quiet little details that didn't quite fit. He was already forming his theory, but Purbright never rushed to conclusions. The truth had a way of revealing itself, but only when the time was right, and for now he would let the town chatter on, let the gossip swirl, for it was often through the smallest of whispers that the largest of truths could be heard. As the evening approached, Purbright made his way toward Mrs. Turner's house. He would begin there. After all, in Flaxborough, no secret was ever truly safe for long. By the time Purbright reached Mrs. Turner's house, the evening had settled into a quiet twilight. The sun, now a mere glimmer on the horizon, cast a soft amber light across the neat row of cottages. The street was empty, save for the occasional rustle of a cat darting between gardens, or the muffled sound of a door closing somewhere in the distance. It was a peaceful scene, the calm that often followed unsettling moments. But for Purbright, the quiet only made the tension sharper, the silence heavier. Mrs. Turner's house was not large, but it was imposing in its own way, with a perfectly manicured front garden that bordered the cobblestone path. The iron gate, freshly painted, creaked slightly as Purbright pushed it open and approached the front door. He hesitated for a moment, taking in the neatness of it all. There was something too meticulous about the house, as though everything was arranged with the sole purpose of creating the illusion of a perfect, untroubled life. He rang the doorbell, and within moments the door swung open to reveal him Mrs. Olivia Turner. The widow was dressed in a deep purple gown, her sharp features framed by a carefully arranged coif of greying hair. Her eyes, dark and watchful, fixed on him with a politeness that bordered on the suspicious. "Inspector Purbright, I presume?" she said, her voice smooth, with an undertone that suggested she had been expecting him. "I trust I'm not disturbing you, Mrs. Turner?" Purbright asked, though he had no doubt she had been anticipating the visit. The woman was rarely caught off guard. "Not at all," she replied, stepping aside to let him in. "Please come in. I was just preparing some tea. Would you care for some?" Purbright declined. There was no time for tea, and besides, he had learned long ago that hospitality in a situation like this could be a way to draw attention away from the matters at hand. He followed her into the sitting room, which was furnished with the same careful attention to detail as the exterior of the house. The room was warm and inviting, the soft glow of the lamps casting long shadows on the walls. Olivia settled into a chair near the window, where the last of the daylight illuminated her face with an almost ethereal glow. "I trust you've heard of the disappearance of Mrs. Ackers?" Purbright began, his tone casual, but his eyes sharp as he observed the widow's reaction. Mrs. Turner's smile wavered ever so slightly before she recovered her composure. "Yes, I've heard. Mildred is a dear woman, though rather private, don't you think?" she said, her voice laced with an unspoken judgment. "Private, yes," Purbright agreed, leaning forward slightly. "And yet I find it curious. You see, Mrs. Turner, I noticed you two conversing quite closely at the flower show yesterday. You seemed rather intent on your conversation." Mrs. Turner's gaze flickered momentarily, a subtle tightening around her eyes that was barely noticeable. She sat up straighter, her fingers curling slightly around the armrest of her chair. "I wouldn't say intent, Inspector. We were merely exchanging pleasantries. You know how it is. Women of a certain age, there's little else to talk about but flowers, gardens, and the occasional remark about the weather." Purbright's lips twitched slightly, but he remained silent, allowing her words to hang in the air. The longer she spoke, the more the room felt charged, as though there were too much left unsaid between them. "And yet," Purbright continued, his voice calm but probing, "I understand that Mrs. Ackers had been upset the past few days. There was some talk that she found something that disturbed her. A letter, perhaps." The mention of the letter was enough to make Mrs. Turner's composure crack just for a fraction of a second. Her eyes darkened, and her fingers tightened around the armrest as though she were trying to anchor herself against the growing tension. But she quickly masked her reaction, replacing it with a smile that was too practiced, too deliberate. "A letter?" she asked, feigning surprise. "I hadn't heard anything about a letter. What sort of letter?" Purbright studied her, weighing her words carefully. One that might suggest Mrs. Ackers had uncovered something that she shouldn't have. Mrs. Turner's smile faltered, and for a moment her eyes flicked toward the window, as though searching for an escape, though she immediately regained control of herself. "I don't know what you mean, Inspector. You'll forgive me, but I find it difficult to believe that Mildred would be involved in anything untoward. She was a quiet woman, reserved. A little too timid, perhaps, but harmless." Purbright remained silent for a long moment, observing her with an intensity that seemed to fill the room. The only sound was the soft ticking of the clock on the mantelpiece, a reminder that time was passing and that questions, no matter how uncomfortable, could not be avoided forever. "I'm sure you're right," Purbright said finally, his voice calm. "But it's curious. You see, I've found a note with some rather troubling words. And it was in Mrs. Ackers's possession when she left the flower show." Mrs. Turner's gaze flickered, a quick glance toward the door that she quickly masked. But Purbright noticed it was enough. "I'm afraid I don't know anything about it," she said quickly, her voice losing some of its earlier polish. "You'll have to excuse me, Inspector. Perhaps I am not the right person for these questions." Purbright smiled thinly, a smile that did not reach his eyes. "Perhaps not, Mrs. Turner, but you may know more than you think." He stood up, his chair scraping against the wooden floor with a slight protest. "Thank you for your time. I may need to return later. I'm sure you understand." "Of course," Mrs. Turner replied quickly, standing as well. "I'll be here, Inspector. I'll be here if you need anything." Purbright nodded once, his eyes never leaving hers. As he made his way toward the door, he allowed himself a moment to observe the room once more, the immaculate furniture, the careful arrangement of ornaments, the unsettling stillness of it all. Olivia Turner was not as innocent as she appeared. That much was clear. Outside, the evening air was cool against his skin, the quiet streets of Flaxborough stretching out before him like a labyrinth of secrets just waiting to be uncovered. He had only begun to scratch the surface, and yet already the town's polite facade was beginning to crack. The pieces were slowly coming together, but the real question was, who had been pulling the strings behind the scenes? And more importantly, who was desperate enough to keep the truth buried? Purbright knew one thing for certain. The answers were closer than they seemed. He could feel it in the way the shadows shifted and in the silence that followed him down the street. And he would find them, one way or another. Purbright walked slowly back toward the centre of Flaxborough, the evening air cooler now as the light faded from the sky. He had been to Mrs. Turner's house, and though she had maintained a perfect air of indifference, Purbright had seen the cracks, tiny, almost imperceptible shifts in her demeanour that suggested the widow knew far more than she let on. The house, the meticulous manner in which she maintained everything, the defensiveness when Mildred's name was brought up, each detail had added to the inspector's growing suspicion. Olivia Turner was involved, whether she realized it or not, but to what extent? The question hung in the air like the shadows that stretched longer along the cobblestones. He stopped at the corner where a small, well-worn bench overlooked the marketplace, now dim and empty, except for a few stragglers wrapping up their evening. He sat down, allowing the quiet to wash over him. There was something about Flaxborough's stillness at dusk that unsettled him, perhaps because he knew that beneath its genteel exterior the town was full of secrets. And Mildred Akers had clearly been keeping one. After a few minutes of reflection, Purbright stood, his gaze lingering on the market stalls that were now empty, their wares neatly packed away. His eyes shifted to the post office at the far end of the square. Blackfriars Lane, the street where Mildred had lived, wasn't far from here. He was already thinking about the next step. His instincts told him that the answer might lie in the smallest of details, those things that no one would ever suspect, but which, if noticed, would reveal the truth. It was the kind of thing that made Purbright's mind work in a way that was uniquely his. There was always a thread, however faint, to follow. He made his way towards the post office, where a light was still on, and the faint clink of metal against metal drifted from within. The postmaster, Mr. Leonard Grange, was still sorting through his evening deliveries. Purbright had known Mr. Grange for years, a man who liked to keep to himself, always polite, but rarely engaging in anything beyond business. He was, however, an excellent source of local gossip, particularly when it came to things that concerned the comings and goings of Flaxborough's inhabitants. Purbright opened the door quietly, stepping into the warm, paper-scented interior. Mr. Grange looked up from his work and nodded, acknowledging Purbright's presence with the customary neutrality that had come to define their interactions. "Evening, Inspector," Grange said with a slight nod. "What can I do for you?" Purbright smiled, though his eyes remained calculating. Just a quick question, Mr. Grange. Have you noticed anything unusual recently? Anything out of the ordinary?" Grange looked at him for a long moment, his brow furrowing in thought. "Unusual? Not much, not really. Same as usual, I suppose." He hesitated, clearly trying to recall something. "Though I did hear some mutterings. Folks have been talking about Mrs. Ackers. She was in here a few days ago collecting her post, looking a bit off, if you ask me." Purbright leaned forward, his interest piqued. "Off? How?" Mr. Grange shifted slightly. The subtle discomfort of someone trying to recall a memory that wasn't entirely clear. "She was agitated, I suppose. Nothing too extreme, but she seemed distracted, kept glancing over her shoulder as though she was expecting someone. And she asked me, rather abruptly, if I had seen her nephew around, said she hadn't heard from him in days. Funny thing, that." Purbright nodded thoughtfully. It was the first solid lead he had come across. Mildred Ackers had been expecting someone, her nephew perhaps. Or was it someone else entirely? That moment of discomfort at the post office might have been the first sign that something was wrong. "What else did she say?" Purbright pressed gently. Grange shifted again, clearly uneasy about speaking too freely, but his instincts had been sharp over the years, and Purbright could tell he was reaching the edge of his memory. "Well, now that you mention it, she was asking a bit too many questions about the parcel service. She wanted to know if I'd seen any unusual packages sent from the area. I thought that was odd. She never had much to do with the parcels before." Purbright absorbed the information, feeling the weight of each detail. Mildred had been looking for something, searching for answers perhaps, even before her disappearance. It wasn't just the letter that had unsettled her. There was something larger at play, a deeper concern that had sent her into a quiet frenzy. "Thank you, Mr. Grange," Purbright said, rising from his seat. "I'll leave you to your work." "Of course, Inspector." "Any time," Grange replied, returning to his task. Purbright left the post office, his mind already racing through the possibilities. The nephew, the unusual inquiries, the fear in Mildred's behaviour. It was all starting to come together, but there were still gaps. Purbright didn't believe in coincidences, and this was no exception. Someone had been watching Mildred, and they hadn't been content to let her search for answers. But who? And why? He walked briskly toward Blackfriars Lane, his thoughts a whirlwind of possibilities. It was time to speak to the neighbours. They might know more than they had let on. At number 15, the house beside Mildred's, lived Mrs. Eva Pike, a gossipy woman in her 60s who had always been fond of passing judgment on her neighbours. She had a sharp eye for detail, though it was often clouded by her own opinions. Purbright knew Eva could be a valuable source, especially if he approached her carefully. He knocked on the door, the sound of it echoing sharply in the still evening. A few moments passed before it opened, revealing Mrs. Pike, who was always quick to wrap herself in layers of disapproving looks and fussy mannerisms. "Yes, Inspector?" she asked, her voice a blend of suspicion and curiosity. "Is something wrong?" "I'm just asking around, Mrs. Pike," Purbright said with his usual calm. "Anything unusual happen around here recently?" Ava's eyes narrowed slightly, but she was always eager to share information, even if it was half-formed or based on gossip. "Well, now that you mention it, I did see something odd the other day. Mrs. Ackers was acting strangely, pacing up and down her front steps like she was waiting for someone. She was looking around all paranoid-like, and then she went into her house, only to come right back out again, as if she'd forgotten something." Purbright's interest piqued. "Did she seem worried about anything in particular?" "Well, now that you ask," Ava said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "I overheard her talking to that solicitor, Mr. Armitage. I know it's none of my business, but I've always found him a bit shady. He was at her house, talking to her in low voices. I don't know what it was about, but it didn't look like the sort of conversation you'd have with a friend." Purbright smiled thinly, a slow, deliberate smile that held no warmth. "Thank you, Mrs. Pike. You've been most helpful." As he turned and walked back down the lane, the pieces began to fall into place. The solicitor, the nephew, the strange behaviour at the post office, it all pointed to a larger mystery than anyone had imagined. But now Purbright had a plan. The next move would require subtlety and a little bit of patience. The game was just beginning. As Purbright made his way down Blackfriars Lane, the last of the evening light faded into the deep shadows of the night. The quiet streets felt heavier now, as though the very air was thick with the unsaid things, the quiet fears of a town that preferred to keep its secrets buried beneath layers of politeness. But the inspector was no stranger to the subtle discomforts of small-town life. It was his job, after all, to uncover those hidden truths, no matter how carefully they were concealed. He walked towards the small cottage at the far end of the street, number 13, where Mrs. Poppy Wright, a widow of another kind, lived. Poppy was Mildred Acker's closest friend, or had been until recently. The two women had always been seen together at the local gatherings, the flower show, the market, the church events, but lately Poppy had become increasingly reclusive. Her visits to the shops had become fewer, and when she did appear in public, she seemed to move with an air of quiet distress, as if she were burdened with a secret. Purbright had spoken to Poppy once or twice before, and he knew that beneath her meek exterior there was a sharp mind at work. She had always been the type to notice things that others missed, and Purbright hoped that she might have seen something, anything that could shed light on Mildred's sudden disappearance. He reached her door and knocked lightly. A few moments passed before the door creaked open, and Poppy appeared, her round face framed by a cascade of white hair. She blinked up at him in surprise, her eyes wide with the sort of nervousness that was becoming more common among the residents of Flaxborough these days. "Good evening, Mrs. Wright," Purbright said, his voice as gentle as always. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." Poppy's gaze darted around the street, as if she were checking for eavesdroppers before she opened the door wider. "Inspector, is it about Mildred?" Her voice was barely a whisper, filled with concern. "I'm afraid so," Purbright replied, stepping inside when invited. I just have a few questions. I'm trying to piece together some of the details of what happened." Poppy nodded, her hands wringing in front of her. "I knew something wasn't right with her, Inspector. You see, Mildred, she'd been acting strangely for the past week or so. At first, I thought it was just her usual nerves, you know how she is, but then, well, I saw something that made me think otherwise." Purbright's attention sharpened. "What did you see, Mrs. Wright?" Poppy hesitated, her eyes flicking to the window before she lowered her voice even further. She'd been talking about a man, a solicitor, I believe, Mr. Armitage. She mentioned him several times in passing, though I never thought much of it. But the last time I saw her, she seemed afraid. She looked over her shoulder as if someone might be following her. I asked her if everything was all right, and she just nodded, but I knew better. She wasn't herself. Purbright remained silent for a moment, processing this new piece of information. The solicitor, Mr. Armitage, seemed to be a more significant figure in this mystery than he had initially thought. It wasn't just a casual acquaintance. There was fear associated with him. But what had he done to cause such anxiety in Mildred? "And what about the letter?" Purbright asked, watching Poppy closely for any signs of hesitation. Poppy's hands trembled slightly, and she avoided looking him in the eye. "She never mentioned a letter, not directly, but I did overhear her talking to Mr. Armitage one afternoon. It was outside near the post office. She was asking him about some kind of legal matter, something that sounded very important. She kept saying she didn't want to get involved, but he was persistent. I could tell." Purbright felt a stir of frustration. There were so many pieces to this puzzle, but they didn't quite fit together. Why had Mildred been involved with Armitage? What was so dangerous that she had become afraid to even mention it to her closest friend? "I see," Purbright said, his tone measured. "And did she mention anything about her nephew, perhaps? Mr. Akers?" Poppy looked at him with a furrowed brow, clearly puzzled. "Her nephew? No, she didn't mention him. But I did hear that she hadn't been in contact with him for some time. I think she was worried about him. He hasn't been around for ages, and Mildred always spoke so highly of him. I wonder if she thought something had happened to him." Purbright stood silently for a moment, his thoughts racing. It was clear that Mildred's concern for her nephew had been genuine, and that whatever was happening now had been building for longer than anyone had realized. She had been looking for answers, perhaps trying to connect dots that no one else could see. "Thank you for your time, Mrs. Wright," Purbright said, offering a small, reassuring smile. "You've been most helpful." Poppy nodded, her expression weary but grateful. "I just want to know what happened to her. She was a good woman. She didn't deserve this." As Purbright left the house, he felt the weight of her words settle heavily on his shoulders. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to align in strange ways. Mildred Akers had been searching for something, answers perhaps, or a way to protect someone. The question now was, what had she discovered, and why had she been silenced before she could uncover it? The more he thought about Mr. Armitage, the more he suspected that the solicitor's involvement wasn't as innocent as it seemed. Purbright needed to speak to him, and he needed to do it quickly. But he also knew that Armitage was likely to be elusive, and whatever games he was playing, he wasn't going to make it easy for the inspector to uncover the truth. Purbright stood for a moment outside Mrs. Wright's house, staring at the peaceful street before him. There was a stillness in the air, but it was the kind of stillness that felt more like a prelude to a storm than the calm after a passing one. The deeper he delved into this case, the more he realized that Flaxborough's seemingly quiet surface was hiding a web of secrets, secrets that would take every ounce of his patience and careful observation to unravel. Tomorrow would bring new questions, new clues, and, Purbright was certain, a confrontation that would reveal much more than anyone was ready for. He turned and walked back toward the center of town, already preparing for the next phase of his investigation. The following morning, Purbright found himself standing outside Armitage's office, a tall, somewhat imposing building on the edge of Flaxborough's Market Square. The building, with its dark oak beams and leaded windows, looked every bit the part of a solicitor's office, solid, respectable, and steeped in old-world formality. Yet there was something about it that made the inspector uneasy. Perhaps it was the shadowed windows that blocked any clear view of what was happening inside, or the way the building seemed to withdraw from the rest of the town, as though it were a place of business that existed just outside the reach of the community. Purbright stood there for a moment, adjusting his coat, his gaze shifting to the door. He had been waiting for this moment. Armitage had been a figure of quiet power in Flaxborough for years, but there was no denying that something about him didn't sit right. The solicitor was smooth, calculated, always polite, never flustered. But there was an undercurrent to him, something Purbright couldn't quite place, a small twinge of discomfort that hovered beneath his carefully constructed mask of civility. The door opened with a creak, and Purbright was greeted by a middle-aged clerk, a man with thinning hair and a well-pressed suit, who eyed him with mild curiosity. "Inspector Purbright, I presume?" the clerk asked, though it wasn't exactly a question. "Mr. Armitage is expecting you." Purbright nodded, offering a polite smile as he stepped inside. The office was exactly what one would expect. Shelves upon shelves of legal books, heavy wooden desks, and dark green curtains that blocked the sunlight, casting the room in a dim, sepia tone. Everything was neat, meticulously organized, the sort of place where details mattered and every object had its place. A sense of formality permeated the air, a quiet reverence for order and tradition that Purbright knew all too well. "Please have a seat," the clerk said, gesturing to the chair opposite a large, polished desk. "Mr. Armitage will be with you shortly." Purbright took the seat, his fingers tapping softly against the armrest as he waited. His mind raced, piecing together everything he had learned over the past days. Mrs. Ackers had been terrified of something, of someone. She had confided in no one, not even her closest friends. Yet somehow Armitage had managed to creep into the edges of her life. What had he wanted? And why had Mildred Ackers, of all people, become a target? A moment later, the door to the inner office opened, and a man entered, his presence immediately commanding the room. Mr. Armitage was exactly as Purbright had imagined, tall, with greying hair, neatly combed back, a sharply cut suit that spoke of wealth and taste, and eyes that seemed to see more than they should. His smile was cool, professional, and entirely untrustworthy. "Inspector Purbright," he said, offering a firm handshake. "I trust I haven't kept you waiting long?" "Not at all," Purbright replied, settling into his chair. He studied Armitage, gauging the man's every movement, every word. "I've come to speak to you about Mrs. Ackers. I understand you've had some dealings with her recently." Armitage's smile didn't falter, but Purbright noticed a slight tension in his jaw. "Ah, Mrs. Ackers. A rather unfortunate situation, isn't it? A lovely woman, but as you know, she had some delicate matters she wished to discuss." "Delicate?" Purbright repeated, his tone casual but firm. "I'm afraid I don't follow." "Ah, forgive me, Inspector. I meant no offence." Armitage leaned back in his chair, his eyes glinting with a hint of something not quite friendly. "It's just that Mrs. Ackers had been involved in a personal matter, nothing criminal, of course, but still, it required some legal attention." Purbright tilted his head slightly, his gaze sharp. "What kind of personal matter?" Armitage hesitated for a moment, then gave a small, almost imperceptible shrug. "A family matter. Her nephew, I believe. She was worried about his future, about some inheritance that had been left to him. Mrs. Ackers was concerned that the estate wasn't being handled properly, and she sought my assistance in making sure everything was in order." "Her nephew?" Purbright repeated, feeling a ripple of unease. "I see. And was this something Mrs. Ackers discussed with you often?" Armitage's smile tightened, just slightly. "Yes, indeed. She was very concerned, as I mentioned. But there was nothing untoward about it, Inspector. Just a matter of ensuring her family's financial interests were properly taken care of." Purbright leaned forward, his fingers steepled together. "I see. And this nephew, you're certain he was the focus of her concerns?" Armitage's eyes flicked away for just a moment, the slightest flicker of uncertainty crossing his face. It was gone before Purbright could fully register it, but it was there, undeniable. "Of course. She wanted to make sure he was provided for, as any aunt would." "Quite," Purbright said softly. "And when was the last time you spoke to Mrs. Ackers?" Armitage's expression remained carefully neutral. "It must have been a few days ago. She seemed fine, though I noticed she was, A little distracted. She mentioned something about needing to take care of a few things. I assumed it was personal business. Purbright's mind worked quickly, piecing together the thread that Armitage had so carefully woven. The solicitor had been involved with Mildred, but there was something off about his version of events. The unease in his eyes, the slight hesitation when he spoke of her nephew. It all pointed to a larger truth that Armitage wasn't willing to acknowledge. "I see," Purbright said slowly, his voice thoughtful. "And you're sure there's nothing more to it? No other concerns or people involved in this matter?" Armitage hesitated again, just for a moment, before he straightened in his chair, his smile returning, with renewed confidence. "Inspector, I assure you there is nothing else to discuss. Mrs. Ackers was a dear woman, and she simply wanted to ensure that everything was in order with her family's affairs. She never indicated any other problems." Purbright nodded, but inside, a small seed of doubt had been planted. He stood, ready to leave, but as he turned to walk toward the door, he paused. There was one last thing he needed to ask. "You know, Mr. Armitage," Purbright began, his voice carrying just the slightest hint of irony, "I've been thinking about Mildred Ackers' disappearance. It's curious. You see, I can't help but wonder why someone who was so concerned with family matters would suddenly vanish without a word, almost as if someone wanted to make sure she stayed quiet." Armitage's expression hardened for a moment, his smile now completely gone. "I don't know what you're insinuating, Inspector." Purbright turned back to face him, his gaze unwavering. "No, Mr. Armitage, but I intend to find out." With that, Purbright left the office, the door clicking shut behind him. The pieces of the puzzle were slowly coming together, but there was still much to uncover. Armitage's story didn't add up, and Purbright was beginning to suspect that the solicitor's involvement in this case went far deeper than anyone had realized. As he walked back down the quiet streets of Flaxborough, the town now shrouded in the thickening fog of evening, Purbright felt a surge of anticipation. He was closer than ever to unraveling the truth. But the deeper he went, the more certain he became of one thing. In Flaxborough, no one was as innocent as they appeared. The next morning, the fog that had rolled in overnight still clung to the streets, shrouding Flaxborough in a damp, heavy quiet. Purbright made his way to the town's modest police station, the early hours offering a brief respite from the oppressive atmosphere that had settled over the case. As he passed the market square, he couldn't shake the sense of things slipping just out of reach, like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle scattered across a table but not yet assembled. The more he learned, the more questions arose, each answer raising new doubts, each lead turning into another dead end. The conversation with Armitage had been enlightening, but it had also been frustrating. The solicitor's polished exterior was hardly shaken by Purbright's inquiries, but there had been moments, a glance here, a hesitation there, that suggested the man knew more than he was letting on. Still, there was no smoking gun, no direct evidence that could tie Armitage to Mildred Ackers's disappearance. And while the solicitor's story about family matters made sense on the surface, something about it felt rehearsed, too neat, too controlled. Purbright pushed open the door to the police station, where Sergeant Giles was already at his desk, his face buried in a stack of paperwork. The sergeant looked up as Purbright entered, offering a brief, tired smile. "Morning,
"Sir," Giles said, his voice gravelly, with the exhaustion of long hours. "You're up early." "I could say the same for you, Sergeant," Purbright replied, his tone mild, though there was a glint of quiet purpose in his eyes. "Any word from the post office?" Giles nodded, flipping through his notes. "I spoke to Mrs. Turner's neighbours this morning. They remember her mentioning the solicitor too. Same story. She was anxious, though no one could say exactly why. It's all a bit circumstantial, sir. Nothing concrete." Purbright didn't respond immediately, his mind working through the fragments of information he'd gathered. The more he learned, the less sense it seemed to make. Mildred had been worried about something, but what? Her nephew, the estate? Or was it something far more sinister, something Armitage wasn't admitting? "Did you manage to track down her nephew?" Purbright asked after a moment. "Still nothing," Giles replied, shaking his head. "It's like he's vanished off the face of the earth. No one's seen him in months, and none of the usual channels have turned up anything. It's almost as if he doesn't exist anymore." That information made the pit in Purbright's stomach tighten. A missing nephew, an anxious aunt, and a solicitor who had too much control over the situation. There was more to this than he could see. Purbright stood, his mind racing. "Get in touch with the family's solicitor again," he said, his voice firm, "and see if you can dig deeper into the nephew's background. Someone must know something." Giles nodded and got to work, tapping furiously at his keyboard. Purbright left the station, the cool, foggy morning air cutting through his coat as he made his way back to Blackfriars Lane. The streets were still quiet, and the town seemed almost frozen in time, as though it too were holding its breath. As he approached Mildred's house, something caught his eye, a figure standing across the street, half hidden in the shadows of the hedges. Purbright's instincts kicked in immediately. He stopped, his eyes narrowing as he tried to make sense of what he was seeing. The figure was watching him, or rather, watching the house. It was hard to make out any details, but the posture, the stillness, it felt too deliberate to be a coincidence. He crossed the street slowly, careful not to make his presence known too soon. The figure didn't move, didn't acknowledge him, as though it had become part of the landscape. Purbright kept his steps slow, his thoughts focused. Whoever this person was, they were waiting for something, or someone. And that something, Purbright suspected, might have something to do with Mildred's disappearance. As he closed the distance between them, the figure shifted, just slightly, turning its head as though sensing Purbright's approach. The moment was brief, fleeting, but enough for Purbright to get a quick look at the face. A woman, perhaps.
In her late 40s, with dark hair pulled into a tight bun. Her features were sharp, her expression unreadable. She didn't seem surprised by his presence, only resigned, as though this encounter was inevitable. Purbright stopped a few paces away, careful to keep his distance. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice steady but cautious. The woman didn't speak immediately. Instead, she studied him for a long moment, her eyes sharp and calculating, as though weighing his worth. Finally, she spoke, her voice low and deliberate. "You're looking for answers, aren't you, Inspector?" Purbright didn't answer immediately, his mind racing with possibilities. "Who are you?" he asked, his tone firm now, not giving an inch. "I think you know who I am," the woman replied, her lips curling into a faint, almost mocking smile. "I've been keeping an eye on this place for a while, just making sure things don't get out of hand." "Out of hand?" Purbright repeated, his suspicion deepening. "What do you mean by that?" The woman stepped closer, her movements slow but deliberate, and for a moment Purbright thought she might be about to reveal something crucial. But then, without another word, she turned sharply and walked away, her pace quickening as she disappeared into the fog. Purbright stood still for a moment, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The woman's words hung in the air, echoing in his mind. Who was she? And what did she know about Mildred Acker's disappearance? There was something in her demeanor, something in the way she had approached him, that suggested she wasn't just a bystander. She knew more than she was letting on. He turned and walked briskly toward the house, his thoughts a whirlwind. Everything was coming together piece by piece, but it still didn't make sense. Mildred Ackers had vanished without a trace, and yet there were so many people who seemed to know more than they were telling. The solicitor, the mysterious woman, someone was hiding something, and Purbright wasn't about to let that something stay hidden for long. The door to Mildred's house creaked open, and Purbright stepped inside. He wasn't sure where this lead would take him, but he knew that things were about to change. Flaxborough was not the quiet, idyllic town it appeared to be. Beneath the surface, there was a dark current running through it, one that he was determined to uncover, no matter where it led. Purbright stood in the centre of the room, the walls echoing with the questions that had yet to be answered. He could feel it now, the weight of the mystery, pressing down on him with an intensity that would not let up until it was solved. The next step would be crucial. He just had to figure out what it was. The fog lingered as Purbright stood in the quiet emptiness of Mildred Ackers's house, his eyes scanning the stillness around him. It was as though the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to break the silence. His mind worked through the fragments of the puzzle: Armitage, the solicitor, Mrs. Turner, Poppy Wright, the mysterious woman in the street, all connected by something invisible, something just out of reach. The more he thought about it, the more certain he became that someone in this town was hiding something. There were too many people who had known Mildred too well, who had seen things that didn't quite make sense. And now, this new figure, the woman who had been watching the house, added another layer to the mystery. She had spoken of keeping things from getting out of hand. What did she mean by that? What was it that was threatening to spill over? Purbright felt the urge to act, to push forward, but he knew he had to tread carefully. Every word, every action had consequences. Flaxborough wasn't a place where things moved quickly, and its people were experts at keeping their secrets just beneath the surface. He had to be patient, observant, let the clues lead him where they would. He left Mildred's house and made his way back to the police station, the fog now thickening around him, wrapping the streets in a damp, almost suffocating cloak. The world felt muted, as though everything was being held in suspension. The occasional car passed by, its headlights cutting through the mist, but for the most part, the town was still, almost frozen in time. At the station, Purbright found Giles still at his desk, sorting through papers. The sergeant looked up as Purbright entered, his face lighting up with a mixture of relief and curiosity. "Sir, I've got something you'll want to see," Giles said, his voice low. He pulled a few sheets of paper from a folder and slid them across the desk. "We've managed to dig up some information on Mrs. Ackers's nephew." Purbright felt a flicker of interest. "What did you find?" Giles tapped a finger on the papers. "It's strange, sir. His name is Charles Ackers. According to the records, he hasn't been seen in Flaxborough for months. No one remembers when he last visited, but there's something odd. His name keeps popping up in various legal transactions. Several documents, signed by Mildred herself, related to financial matters. The last one was just a few weeks ago. It's almost as if she was preparing for something." Purbright's mind raced. A nephew who had been practically invisible for months, yet there was a trail of paperwork, a connection to Mildred's financial dealings. Why would she need to prepare something, and why keep it hidden? The idea that Mildred had been dealing with financial issues, possibly involving her nephew, was not new, but this new information cast a darker light on the situation. "Did you find out anything about his whereabouts?" Purbright asked, already knowing the answer. Giles shook his head. "Nothing concrete, sir. It's like he vanished, but I did find a lead, a recent address in
London. We've sent a few inquiries, but nothing yet." Purbright stood up, the weight of the case settling on him like a heavy cloak. We need to get to the bottom of this, Giles. The nephew, the solicitor. Something is off, and I have a feeling it's all connected. I'll get on it right away, sir, Giles said, already flipping through his notes. Purbright turned and walked out of the station, his thoughts consumed by the latest revelation. The financial dealings, the documents signed by Mildred, the disappearance of her nephew, all of it pointed towards something far more complex than a simple disappearance. But what? And why had Mildred been so careful, so secretive? He walked through the fog, the streets now nearly deserted. The occasional light flickered in the windows of houses, casting long shadows across the pavement. There was a chill in the air, a reminder that time was passing and that things were slipping away from him, just as they always did in these cases. He couldn't help but wonder if he was getting closer to the truth, or if it was just another step down a road that would lead him to nowhere. His mind returned to the woman he had seen earlier, the one standing across from Mildred's house. Why had she been watching? What did she know? It seemed as though every step forward uncovered yet another mystery, another question. There were too many people with too many answers, but no one was telling the whole truth. Purbright knew one thing for certain. Someone was lying, and he was going to find out who. The next morning, Purbright returned to Mrs. Turner's house. The fog had finally begun to lift, though the air was still damp and cool. Mrs. Turner was in her garden, kneeling by her flower beds, as she had been the day before. She looked up as he approached, her eyes narrowing slightly. There was no surprise in her gaze, only a quiet acknowledgement of his return. "Inspector," she said, standing slowly, her fingers brushing the soil from her hands. "What brings you here today?" Purbright studied her carefully. He had never quite trusted her, not since their first conversation. There was something about her, an edge that seemed to mask something darker beneath. "I'm afraid I'm back to ask you a few more questions, Mrs. Turner, about your conversation with Mrs. Ackers." Mrs. Turner stiffened, though she did her best to hide it. "I told you everything I know, Inspector. There's nothing more to say." Purbright didn't answer right away. Instead, he took a step closer, his tone softening just slightly. "You and Mrs. Ackers were close, weren't you? You must have known if something was troubling her." She paused, her lips tightening. "I'm not sure what you're implying, Inspector." "Mildred was a private woman. I never asked her about things she didn't want to talk about." Purbright smiled faintly. "Of course. But it's funny, isn't it? How we never ask questions, yet we always
seem to know something is wrong, don't we?" Mrs. Turner's eyes flickered, a brief flash of discomfort crossing her face. She swallowed, then nodded, though she said nothing more. "I'll be in touch, Mrs. Turner," Purbright said, turning on his heel and walking away. He had gotten no new answers, but he didn't need to. The subtle change in her demeanour, the quickness with which she dismissed him, those were the things that mattered. As he left her house, Purbright felt the weight of the case closing in on him. The pieces were almost in place, but there was still one last question that lingered, like a shadow just outside his reach. What had Mildred Ackers known? And what had made her so afraid to speak? The fog was lifting, but the mystery was far from solved. The fog had finally lifted, but the tension in Flaxborough hung like a cloud, thick and impenetrable. Purbright spent the rest of the afternoon retracing his steps through the town, revisiting places he had already been, watching for things he might have missed. He was beginning to feel as though the town itself was a puzzle, its every face, every street corner, a piece that didn't quite fit. The more he searched, the more elusive the truth seemed. He returned to the police station, his mind heavy with thoughts of Mrs. Turner and the cryptic words she had shared. There was something in her eyes, something he couldn't quite place. Had she been trying to mislead him, or was she just a frightened woman trying to cover up a deeper truth? Purbright wasn't sure yet, but he knew one thing for certain. She was involved in this, whether she realized it or not. Inside the station, Giles was waiting for him, a report in hand. The sergeant looked up as Purbright entered, his usual neutral expression now tinged with a trace of excitement. "Sir, you're going to want to see this." Purbright took the report and skimmed over the details. It was about Mildred Acker's nephew, Charles. It seemed Giles had managed to track down a relative of his, a distant cousin, who had been in contact with him in recent months. According to the cousin, Charles had been acting strangely before he disappeared, nervous, agitated, like he was running from something. The cousin didn't know much more, but she mentioned one thing that caught Purbright's attention. Charles had been in possession of a significant amount of money just before he vanished. The cousin believed it was connected to an inheritance, but it was unclear from where. Purbright felt the pieces of the puzzle begin to shift again. The inheritance. Mildred's secret dealings with Armitage. The strange disappearance of her nephew. It was all beginning to tie together. But the question remained. What had Mildred known? What had she uncovered that had made her so afraid? "Did you manage to track down the address in London?" Purbright asked, his voice calm but insistent. Giles nodded, his face tightening slightly. "I've got an
address, but there's something odd about it. It's a post office box, not a real address. And there's no forwarding address for Charles, no other leads. It's as if he's disappeared off the grid completely." Purbright stood silently for a moment, the weight of the case pressing on him. "Get in touch with the post office, Giles. We need to find out who's been using that box and check the local records again. I'm willing to bet that whoever's behind this has been playing the long game." Giles nodded, already heading toward his desk to make the necessary calls. Purbright turned and left the station, stepping into the street. The day was fading into twilight, the town bathed in the soft glow of street lamps. He walked slowly, letting his thoughts wander through the maze of the case. There were still so many unknowns. Armitage, the mysterious woman in the shadows, the missing nephew. And then there was Mrs. Turner, whose role in this whole affair still didn't make sense. Purbright paused in front of Mrs. Turner's house again, his eyes scanning the windows, the neatly tended garden. It was hard to reconcile the image of the delicate widow with the woman who had been hiding something. There was more to her than met the eye, and Purbright was certain now that she knew something crucial about Mildred's disappearance. He walked up to the door and knocked. A few moments later, Mrs. Turner opened it, her expression unreadable. "Inspector," she said, as though she had been expecting him. "Back so soon?" "I need to speak with you again, Mrs. Turner," Purbright said, his voice soft but steady. "There are things about Mildred's disappearance that don't add up, and I think you know more than you've let on." Her eyes flickered for the briefest moment, a flash of something, fear, maybe, before she masked it with a tight smile. "I've told you everything I know. There's nothing more I can say." Purbright didn't push immediately, though he could feel the tension between them. "I don't think you're being completely honest with me, Mrs. Turner. I've spoken to people who've mentioned your conversations with Mildred, and I'm starting to think that you're protecting someone who doesn't want the truth to come out." Mrs. Turner's smile faltered, and for the briefest moment, her hands trembled at her sides. But then she straightened, her composure returning with force. "Inspector, you're mistaken. I have no idea what you're talking about." Purbright's eyes never left hers. "I don't believe you. and I'm not going to stop until I find out what you're hiding." For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of the wind rustling the leaves in the garden. Mrs. Turner didn't speak, her gaze steady and resolute. Finally, she spoke, her voice low and calm. "If you think you're going to find the truth by threatening me, Inspector, you're wrong," she said softly.
I've told you all I know, but if you want to keep digging, go ahead. You might be surprised by what you uncover, but be careful. Not all truths are meant to be found. Purbright studied her for a long moment, the words hanging in the air between them. There was something there, something hidden behind her calm exterior. It was clear now that she was more involved in this than she had let on. But why was she so determined to keep the truth buried? "I'll be back," Purbright said, his voice a little colder now. "And when I return, I expect you to be ready to tell me everything." Mrs. Turner nodded, her lips tight. "I'm not hiding anything from you, Inspector, but remember, there are some things that are better left untouched." Purbright didn't respond. Instead, he turned and walked away, his thoughts racing. Every word, every interaction was a clue, and it was clear now that Mrs. Turner knew far more than she was letting on. The pieces were falling into place, but Purbright knew he had to be patient. The truth was out there, buried beneath layers of lies and deception. And with every step he took, he was getting closer to uncovering it. But it wasn't going to be easy. Flaxborough wasn't a town that gave up its secrets lightly. As the fog began to roll in once again, Purbright felt a flicker of something inside him, anticipation perhaps, or the gnawing sense that the final piece of the puzzle was within reach. He didn't know what he would find when he returned to Mrs. Turner's house, or what other secrets Flaxborough was hiding, but he was ready. Whatever the cost, he was determined to uncover the truth. The next few days were a blur of questions and dead ends. Purbright had returned to Mrs. Turner's house several more times, each visit pushing her deeper into her shell. The walls she had built around herself were growing thicker, and her patience with his inquiries was wearing thin. Yet each time he spoke to her, he felt the air grow heavier, as though she was standing on the edge of revealing something important. But each time she pulled back. Flaxborough itself seemed to resist the investigation, its small town tranquility clinging stubbornly to the surface, while beneath it, tensions simmered just out of sight. Purbright walked the streets, observing the familiar faces, the polite nods, and the hushed conversations behind drawn curtains. He could feel the weight of the secrets pressing against the town, and it frustrated him to no end that they remained just beyond his reach. It wasn't until a call came through from Giles that things began to shift. "Sir, I think you'll want to hear this," Giles said, his voice tight with urgency. "We've found something." Purbright, who had been sitting in his office, his mind still spinning from his last conversation with Mrs. Turner, straightened immediately. "What did you find?" "There's a connection between Armitage and a set of financial documents linked to Mildred Acker's estate," Giles continued. "The documents were signed just before her disappearance, some sort of transfer of assets, moving large sums of money from her account. We're looking into the details, but we've got confirmation that Armitage was involved in some capacity. The documents point to him as the executor." Purbright's pulse quickened. This was the break he'd been waiting for. Armitage's name had come up repeatedly, but this was the first real piece of evidence that tied him directly to the mystery. It was no longer just a question of Mildred's disappearance. Now there was something much larger at play, something financial, something that involved power, control, and perhaps deceit. "Get me everything you can on those documents, Giles, and find out who else was involved in that transfer," Purbright said, already standing and grabbing his coat. This is bigger than we thought. The drive to the station was a blur, the fog thickening again, draping the streets in a damp, oppressive blanket. By the time he arrived, Giles had gathered a stack of papers detailing the financial transfers. It was all laid out in front of him: bank statements, wire transfers, signatures. Armitage's name appeared at the bottom of every page, like a silent watermark on everything Mildred had done in her final days. Purbright's eyes narrowed as he studied the documents. They were complicated, but there was one thing that stood out above all else. The money wasn't just being moved, it was being hidden. Some of it had been transferred into an offshore account in the Cayman Islands, a place that was notorious for its lack of transparency. And even more troubling, the transfer had been authorized by Mildred herself just days before her disappearance. "Who else is connected to this account?" Purbright asked, his voice low, filled with the weight of what he was seeing. Giles flipped through the papers. "There's a second name, a woman named Eliza Hartwell. She was a trustee for some of the estate's assets. I haven't found much on her yet, but she's tied directly to the offshore account." Eliza Hartwell. The name was unfamiliar to Purbright, but it sounded like someone who had remained deliberately out of the public eye. And given the connections, it was clear that she was no mere bystander. She had to know something. Purbright felt a cold certainty that the last piece of this puzzle was now in sight. "Get a team together. I want to find out everything we can about Eliza Hartwell," he said, his voice steady with resolve. "And get in touch with Armitage. I think it's time we had a little chat." Giles nodded, already pulling his phone from his pocket. "Understood, sir." Purbright left the station shortly after, his mind buzzing with possibilities. There was no doubt that the story was far from over. This was just the beginning. Armitage, Mrs. Turner, Eliza, Hartwell, each of them had their part to play in whatever had happened to Mildred Ackers. But Purbright knew he was close. He could feel it in his bones. The last thread was unraveling, and soon the truth would be laid bare. The next few days passed in a flurry of interviews, phone calls, and research. Purbright's days blurred together as he dug deeper into Eliza Hartwell's life. She had been a quiet figure, a woman who had kept to the background. Her name had never come up in any of the previous investigations, which in hindsight was exactly what made her so suspicious. It wasn't just that she was involved in the financial dealings, it was the fact that no one seemed to know anything about her. Giles finally returned with news. "We've got her, sir," he said over the phone. "Eliza Hartwell's in town. She's been living in a cottage just outside Flaxborough, practically hidden away. It's not far from where Mildred lived." "Perfect," Purbright muttered. "It's time to pay her a visit." He arrived at the small cottage late that afternoon, the sun casting long shadows across the overgrown garden. The place had an air of neglect, as if the owner had been absent for a long time. He knocked on the door, and after a moment it creaked open. A woman stood there, tall and gaunt, her eyes sharp and wary. She had the air of someone who knew they were being watched, but had grown accustomed to it. "You must be Eliza Hartwell," Purbright said, his voice calm but firm. "I need to speak with you." Her eyes flickered with recognition, then quickly masked themselves. "What's this about?" she asked, her voice guarded. "I have questions about Mildred Ackers," Purbright said, stepping into the doorway. "And about the transfer of her assets. I think you know more than you're letting on." For a long moment there was silence. Then Eliza stepped back, gesturing for him to enter. "I suppose we should talk then," she said, her voice soft but resolute. As Purbright stepped inside, he couldn't shake the feeling that this conversation would be the one that finally cracked the case wide open. Everything had led him here, to this moment, And now the truth was finally within reach. Purbright stepped into the cottage, his boots creaking on the wooden floor, as Eliza Hartwell led him through the narrow hallway. The place was dimly lit, the only light coming from a single window covered in lace curtains. The smell of dust and old wood permeated the air, and everything was just slightly askew, as if the house had been untouched for years. Eliza moved ahead of him, her thin figure leading the way with a purposeful stride, but her back was stiff, and her movements carried an unmistakable tension. She stopped in a small sitting room at the back of the house, motioning for him to take a seat. The furniture was sparse, but neat. The walls were lined with bookshelves, most of them filled with legal texts, old papers, and a few scattered mementos. Everything in the room seemed meticulously placed, yet there was a chill about it. It felt more like a place someone lived in only part-time, a place they tried to forget. "Please," Eliza said, gesturing to the chair opposite hers. "Sit." "I suppose we have a lot to discuss." Purbright didn't sit right away. Instead, he studied her carefully, watching for any signs of unease. She had the appearance of someone who was used to being in control, but there was a wariness in her eyes, a flicker of something buried deep beneath her calm demeanor. "I'm sure you know why I'm here," Purbright said after a moment, his voice measured, calm. He took a seat, leaning forward slightly. "I'm investigating the disappearance of Mildred Ackers, and I believe you were involved in some way, particularly with the financial matters surrounding her estate." Eliza's face remained impassive, though her hands tightened ever so slightly around the edge of her chair. "Mildred was a client," she said slowly, as if testing her own words. "A very private one, mind you, but yes, I was involved in managing her affairs, particularly after her husband's death." Purbright nodded, allowing her to speak without interruption, but he was already piecing together what he had learned. Mildred had kept her financial dealings quiet, but Eliza had been involved in some of the final, secretive transactions, the offshore accounts, the unexplained transfers. It all pointed back to her. "I've seen the documents," Purbright said, his voice soft but firm. "The transfers to the offshore accounts, the large sums of money being moved under your watch, and then there's the matter of Charles Ackers, Mildred's nephew. I'm beginning to think he was just the tip of the iceberg. There's more to this, isn't there?" Eliza didn't flinch. She merely studied him with an unreadable expression, her fingers still gripping the armrests of her chair. For a long moment she said nothing, her eyes calculating as she weighed her next words. "You're right," she said, finally, her voice low but steady. "There is more. Much more." Purbright sat back in his chair, his eyes never leaving hers. This was the breakthrough he'd been waiting for, but there was something in her tone, something in the way she spoke, that made him cautious. He knew he had to tread carefully. He was on the edge of something, but he wasn't sure what it was. "Mildred knew about the money," Eliza continued, her gaze dropping to the floor for a brief moment before meeting his eyes again. "She knew what was happening and she didn't like it. She wanted out. She wanted to stop it." "Stop what?" Purbright asked, his voice sharp now. "What was happening?" Eliza hesitated, as if the words were caught in her throat. When she spoke again, it was as if she had made a decision. She leaned forward, her voice barely above a whisper. "There's a lot of money tied up in this town, Inspector," she said, her words laced with bitterness. "A lot more than you realize. The Ackers estate was just a small piece of it, but it was the key. Mildred was trying to protect her family, but she couldn't do it alone. There were others involved, people who wanted control, and they were willing to do anything to get it." Purbright felt a chill creep down his spine. He had suspected something deeper, something darker, but hearing it from her lips made it all too real. The stakes were higher than he had imagined. This wasn't just about Mildred anymore. This was about something much larger, something that had been quietly simmering beneath the surface of Flaxborough for far too long. "Who were these people?" Purbright pressed, his voice low, insistent. "Who else is involved in this?" Eliza shook her head, her eyes darting nervously toward the window. "I can't tell you everything, not yet. But I can tell you this. Mildred's death wasn't an accident. It wasn't even a disappearance. She was murdered, and they made sure that no one would find out what happened to her." Purbright's heart pounded in his chest. Everything he had thought he knew about the case suddenly felt irrelevant. He had been chasing shadows, following a trail of breadcrumbs that led nowhere. And now Eliza Hartwell was telling him that everything, every piece of evidence, every interview, had been a carefully crafted diversion. "Murdered?" Purbright echoed, his voice tight. "You're telling me Mildred Ackers was killed?" Eliza nodded, her face pale as she looked back at him. She found out too much. She knew about the offshore accounts, the illegal transfers, and she knew about the people who were pulling the strings. She was going to expose them. She had planned to go to the authorities, but... "But what?" Purbright asked, his voice rising slightly. "But she never made it," Eliza whispered, her voice cracking. "They got to her first, and they made sure she was silenced for good." Purbright sat still, processing her words, his mind racing. Everything had changed in an instant. Mildred Ackers hadn't just vanished. She had been silenced by someone powerful, someone with the means to erase her from existence. And now, it seemed, that same someone was trying to cover their tracks. The people behind this weren't just local criminals. They were connected, well connected, and they had the resources to make anyone disappear. "I need names, Eliza," Purbright said, his voice cold now, his determination setting in. "Who are these people? Who killed Mildred Ackers?" Eliza's eyes flickered with fear, and for the first time, Purbright saw a crack in her composure. She was afraid of something more than the consequences of telling the truth. "I don't know all of their names," Eliza whispered, her voice barely audible. "But I can tell you this much. They're people
you would never suspect. They've been hiding in plain sight, running their operations under the radar for years, and they'll stop at nothing to keep their secrets safe." Purbright leaned forward, his gaze fixed on her. "Tell me everything you know, Eliza. Every detail. It's the only way to make this right." Eliza hesitated, her eyes darting around the room as if she was searching for a way out. But there was no escape now. She had already started down the path, and there was no turning back. "All right," she said finally, her voice resolute. "I'll tell you what I know. But you have to promise me one thing, Inspector. You have to promise me you'll be careful." Purbright nodded, a grim determination settling over him. "I promise." And with that, Eliza Hartwell began to speak, slowly at first, then faster as the truth began to spill out. Eliza's voice trembled at first, but as she spoke, the truth seemed to pour out of her with an urgency that surprised Purbright. She explained, her words clipped and filled with quiet intensity, that Mildred Ackers had indeed uncovered something far darker than anyone had realized. It wasn't just about the financial dealings or the mysterious offshore accounts. Those were only the surface. The real issue lay deeper in the tangled web of corruption that reached its fingers into some of Flaxborough's most respected figures. Mildred wasn't just worried about her nephew's inheritance, Eliza said, her gaze flicking to the window as though the very thought of what she was revealing might attract unwanted attention. She was worried about her own safety. She had found something that connected people here, in this town, to operations far bigger than Flaxborough itself. Purbright leaned forward, every fibre of his being focused on her words. "Who, Eliza?" Who's behind this? Eliza hesitated, clearly grappling with the weight of what she was about to say. I told you there were names you wouldn't expect, people with power, people like Armitage, yes, but also others, wealthy families who've been here for generations. They've managed to keep everything under wraps using legal loopholes and under-the-table dealings to maintain control. She paused, her expression darkening as she searched for the right words. But it's more than that. These people were involved in a much larger network, an underground operation that handled far more than just money. I don't know all the details, but Mildred did. She was getting close to exposing them, and they knew it. Purbright sat still, absorbing her words. His mind was already racing, connecting the dots. It made sense now. Mildred's sudden fear, her retreat into secrecy, the odd interactions with Armitage, it was all beginning to fit together. There was something systemic here, something so entrenched in Flaxborough's fabric that it had escaped even his keen eye. How did they silence her?
Purbright asked, his voice cold, cutting through the tension in the room. Eliza's face twisted with guilt. They didn't do it directly. It wasn't as simple as that. No, they manipulated the situation. Mildred trusted the wrong people. She thought she could expose them without putting herself at risk, but she was wrong. They planted false evidence, made it look like she was losing her mind, that she was being paranoid. She started pulling away from everyone, especially me. And then when she finally realized how close she was to the truth, she tried to confront them. Purbright's pulse quickened. And they killed her. Eliza's eyes filled with unshed tears, but she didn't look away. Yes, they staged her disappearance, made it look like she just vanished. But they couldn't risk her talking. She was too dangerous. They knew too much about her, about what she'd found. Silence hung in the air for a long moment. Purbright let her words settle in his mind. He had suspected something along these lines, but hearing it confirmed, that this was about more than just a woman gone missing, left him with a heavy sense of dread. Mildred Ackers had been a casualty of something far greater than a personal dispute. She had been caught in a vast underground operation with reach and influence that extended far beyond the small town of Flaxborough. Eliza, Purbright said, his voice steady now, I need you to tell me everything you know about this network. Names, connections, everything. She shook her head slowly. I don't know all the details. I was only ever involved in the legal side of things. But I know enough to understand that the people behind this, they're not just in Flaxborough, they're all over the country. And some of them, well, her voice trailed off as she seemed to contemplate the gravity of her words. Some of them are untouchable. Purbright clenched his fists, his frustration rising. Who are they, Eliza? Who is running this operation? Her eyes locked onto his, and for a moment there was a flicker of resolve in her expression. I can't give you names. Not without putting myself in more danger than I already am. But I can tell you one thing. Mildred was right. She found the key to something they'd been hiding for years. And when she started digging deeper, they made sure she wouldn't get out alive. Purbright's mind whirled as the pieces fell into place. If Mildred had found the key to this operation, if she had been so close to exposing the truth, it meant the people behind it were desperate. They weren't going to let this go, not without a fight. And now, with Eliza's reluctant help, Purbright was closer than ever to unraveling the full extent of what had happened. I need to see the records, Eliza, any documents Mildred left behind, any notes she made, anything she might have had that could tie this together, Purbright said, his voice firm with
resolve. Eliza hesitated, glancing toward the back of the cottage, her expression torn. There's one more thing, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Mildred had a meeting set up. She was going to confront someone about everything she had uncovered. Someone high up. I don't know who it was, but I have the address. Purbright's heart raced. This was it. The final piece of the puzzle. Whoever Mildred had been planning to confront, they were the key to everything. Give me the address, Purbright demanded, his voice hard. Now! Eliza reached into a drawer beside her and pulled out a small envelope, handing it to him without a word. Purbright opened it carefully, scanning the address quickly. It was a place on the outskirts of Flaxborough, a nondescript warehouse that he had passed by several times but never given a second thought. It was the kind of place that blended into the background, easy to overlook, just the sort of location someone would use if they didn't want to be found. Eliza, I need you to stay here. Don't leave this house, Purbright said urgently, slipping the envelope into his coat pocket. I don't know what's waiting for me at that address, but I'm going to find out. And when I do, I'm going to make sure Mildred's death wasn't in vain. She nodded, her face pale, but her eyes filled with something close to gratitude. Be careful, Inspector. They won't make it easy for you. Purbright gave her a brief nod before turning toward the door. His steps were quick and purposeful as he left the cottage, the final piece of the puzzle now in his hands. The endgame was approaching, and the truth was finally within reach. But Purbright knew better than anyone that the closer he got to uncovering it, the more dangerous things were about to become. Flaxborough's darkest secrets were about to be exposed, and nothing would ever be the same again.